Right, so now what we're going to turn our attention to is, in a very broad sense, we're going to look at trade policies. So now we've gone from, if you like, models of looking at things like comparative advantage and etc., throughout most of this course, to looking at what countries actually do in terms of their attitude, if you like, almost to trade, to international trade. We're going to start off here looking at probably one of the most common historically, one of the oldest forms of trade policy, and that's tariffs. And in a subsequent video, we're going to look at the welfare effects of this. But at the moment, we're just going to set this up and have a look at the effect of a tariff on things like the prices of the goods and the amount of trade that occurs. And we're going to see that um, one of the things that we're going to look at here is that the impacts, if you like, will vary depending on whether the country imposing the tariff is a large country or a small country. But before that, we'll just want to set up the mechanics of it, and so that shortly we can look at the welfare effects of it. Okay, so what should a nation's trade policy be? Should we, for example, should Australia, for example, use a tariff to protect its car industry, which is what, of course, we did for many years? Australia also had significant tariffs on things like clothing, footwear, etc. So we want to look at this and we want to go, well, who is going to benefit and who will lose in terms of, and again, we're going to look at this mainly in terms of a welfare analysis, but we're going to look at the types of groups, if you like, that win and lose, the producers versus consumers, essentially, with a bit of government thrown in terms of the tariff tax revenue. Then we're going to look at whether the benefits overall, in other words, the benefits to those who gain, outweigh the cost to those who lose, or whether the opposite occurs. So as I said, tariffs are one of the oldest forms of trade policy, and they've been used for a couple of reasons over the years. One of them has been to provide government revenue, just purely not thinking about the welfare effects, if you like, simply as a way for the government to raise money, in the same way that income tax raises revenue for the government, or a value-added tax or GST, these sorts of things. But of course, the more controversial from a policy perspective is that a tariff is often put in place to protect domestic sectors. And they go back a long way, as we said. We had the famous Corn Laws in the UK in the early 19th century, which was designed to, and this word is corn is a bit misleading. It was actually essentially wheat, or wheat was the main one, and it was designed to protect the domestic British agricultural industry from import competition from Europe, and was quite controversial at the time. And one of the areas of importance, if you like, is that this is one of the first examples. This law, or the repeal of the law in the mid 19th century, was almost one of the first victories, if you can call it that, from economists. So there were a number of economists. Ricardo, of course, was one of the most famous ones, who argued very strongly against these corn laws. Basically, the price that domestic consumers had to pay for agriculture outweighed the benefits, if you like, to the producers of the agriculture. And so the final repeal of these laws was seen as a victory for free trade, if you like, and certainly showed the way. I mean, this is neither here nor there, but one of the offshoots or consequences of the Corn Laws was actually the establishment of the Economist magazine. And of course, the Economist magazine argued very strongly that the Corn Laws should be repealed, and that prices that consumers would pay for the agriculture would outweigh the benefits of that would outweigh the costs to the local producers. Anyway, we also have seen numerous examples over history of other countries protecting their new, the kind of infant industry argument, where they're protecting their new sectors by imposing tariffs on imports of those same goods coming in from overseas. So Germany did it, the US did it, etc. Now, in subsequent videos, we're also going to be looking at other, what we call non-tariff barriers, because of course tariffs are not the only kind of trade policy that countries use. But here we're just going to focus exclusively on the issue of tariffs. You can see that over at least the last 30 years, and actually we could go a little bit further back on this, that average world tariffs have been falling significantly. This is on the left-hand scale, so from an average of around about 10% back in the early to mid 1980s, down to approximately 3% nowadays. A lot of the, as we're going to see in subsequent videos, a lot of the push now in terms of reducing tariffs and freeing up trade is now occurring in other areas like the services sector. So this has overwhelmingly been in terms of manufactured goods over the years. That battle, if you like, is almost over in the sense of pure tariffs. But there are many other sectors of an economy that is open to trade that could be where lower tariffs, if you like, could be employed, and non-tariff barriers too. So what we want to look at here is we want to derive what we call an import demand curve, then an export curve, and then we're going to bring them together to look at world demand and supply. Okay, so an import demand curve is the difference between the quantity that home consumers demand minus the quantity that home producers will supply at each price. So in other words, this import demand, MD, is simply the demand for the product minus the supply, domestic supply of the product. So for example, here on the left-hand side diagram, you can see we've got a domestic demand curve and a domestic supply curve from domestic producers. At point A, you can see the intersection here. Basically, on this right-hand side diagram, we've got an input demand. You can see that this hits, if you like, the vertical axis. In other words, the quantity of imports is zero because everything that is demanded in the economy is supplied domestically. So this is a normal, this PA here is just a normal domestic equilibrium price. And of course, at that equilibrium price, there is no imports because all consumption is produced locally. But as the price drops from this PA, pick a point here, for example, P1, you can see that the demand is higher, D1, because of the lower price. But because of that lower price, the quantity being supplied domestically is going to be less. So here we've got demand exceeding supply. Where are the consumers going to get their demand? Well, they get it from imports. So this gives us a point on our import demand curve in terms of the quantity of imports required, that D1 minus S1. And of course, we can keep doing this as the price gets lower and lower. As the price gets lower, the domestic demand increases even more to say D2, the domestic supply decreases further to say S2, and so of course that results in even higher imports. So that S1 minus D1, that's that point there, and then D2 minus S2 comes from there. And so we can just join the dots, and that is our import demand curve. So it's simple enough, okay? Obviously, we don't go to a price above this because there's certainly no imports if the price rises above PA, because the domestic demand is actually less than the domestic supply. Turning to our export supply curve, it's the difference between the quantity that foreign producers supply minus the quantity that foreign consumers demand at each price. So again, looking at this from the opposite angle here, again, take the domestic equilibrium price. I've called that PA star. And at that price, again, there's no exports, right? Again, for the same reason as before, the quantity demanded domestically in the foreign country is exactly equal to the quantity being supplied in the foreign country. But as the price rises, pick a price like P1, you can see that the quantity being supplied here at S star 1 exceeds the demand, the domestic demand, D star 1, and so we've got positive now amounts of exports. And as the price rises, that difference gets greater and greater. So again, it's PA here, for example, where you've got the domestic demand is quite low because of the relatively high price. The domestic supply is quite great. What's that difference? Well, where's the rest of that supply going? It's being exported. So again, this translates directly, maps directly into our export supply curve. Join the dots, and there's our export supply curve. So of course we can bring them together into this world equilibrium where we've got our export supply curve and our import demand curve. And that leads us to having a world price. So you can see here, I've just put in the points where there was no exports and no imports, the PA and the PA star. But we do have this world, this leads to this world equilibrium price and quantity. So in other words, the home demand minus the home supply is equal to the foreign supply minus the foreign demand. That's that point there, PW. Yeah. What we can do then is actually rearrange this and get demand on one side and supply on the other. So you can bring the foreign demand over to the left-hand side. So it's home demand plus foreign demand. Take the home supply over to the right-hand side. That leaves us with home supply plus foreign supply. So that collectively, the left-hand side in green is world demand, and on the right-hand side is world supply. So world demand at this point here at PW, world demand is equal to world supply. So that's easy enough. That gives us that world price. What we want to look at then is what happens if a tariff is imposed in the home country. Now, I haven't really got it explicitly here, but I probably should have. But this first example here is what happens if the home country is a large country. What that means is that when it's a large country, the effect matters. The effect will move the world market. Yeah. In other words, it'll change the price in the world market. So if you tariff like a shipping cost, okay, it adds a cost to the seller of selling it into the home country. There's going to be a price at which basically it makes it not worth it, right? In other words, the price that they'll receive for the good, you whack on the tariff on top of that, means that the foreign country has nothing to gain by actually selling into that country. So in other words, that PT minus the tariff is greater than the post-tariff price. So what we want to look at here, this at the moment, get my pointer. This here doesn't necessarily mean much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the model whereby this occurs. Okay. So if that net home price, if you like, is less than the post-tariff foreign price, then the good's not being shipped. Okay. However, we're not going to look at that situation per se. We're going to look at what happens if the tariff is imposed and what happens to the supply, the exports, if you like, of the good from the foreign country into the home country, and obviously what happens to demand in the home country. And what we're going to see, and this is jumping ahead to the sort of end result, if you like, is that the price in the home country will rise. That's the tariff, okay? And the price received in the foreign country is going to fall, and that will keep going until the difference in the price between the home and the foreign country is equal to that tariff, okay? T, small t. So looking at this, okay, so basically on the left-hand side here, I've got the home market. On the very far right, I've got the foreign market, and in the middle, I've got the world market. What we're going to see, this home country here is a large country, and so when the tariff is imposed, it actually makes a difference to the world market. Okay, so the tariff, of course, creates a wedge, if you like, in the home market. So remember, we were at, say, at this point 1, where in the home market, the domestic demand exceeded the supply, so that was what they wanted to import, and of course, for the foreign country, that difference there represents the exports into that country, and we had that equilibrium world price. So we've got this tariff. So this is the full size of the tariff. Remember, the government will receive the full amount of the tariff. So if that's $2 per unit or whatever it is, then they will receive $2. This is sort of like the tax incidence that you might have learnt, certainly in first year, but perhaps in subsequent units. the incidence or burden of a tax, if you like, and how it is distributed between the buyers and the sellers. So first thing to note, okay, the price in the home market is going to rise. And I'm just going to get to the end result. It's going to rise up to here. So this post-tariff price here. Now, of course, when that happens, in the home market, you get two things happening. Obviously, with the higher price, you get a lower quantity being demanded, and you get a higher domestic quantity being produced. And so we get a decrease in the amount of trade that's required. Essentially, the imports you can see here. I've got it eventually here in a sec, but the imports here with this size here, and now obviously with the price of the tariff imposed, the imports are going to be less. So we're going to move back up along our import demand curve to a point like that. In terms of the foreign market, it's actually going to lower the net price, if you like, that they'll receive. They'll receive P star T, then they have to pay that tariff, which is equal to that T. Remember, they have to pay the full amount, and that will ultimately mean that the net price, or the ultimate price, is that PT. Right? And again, you can see here that with the lower price, the domestic producers in the foreign market will produce less, and the lower price will mean that domestic demand in the foreign country will increase, resulting in lower exports. So lower imports here, obviously lower exports there. So in foreign, the lower price will decrease supply, increase demand, so less is exported. So what you've got here is you've got point 2 here that I've labelled here, point 2, which is the demand, import demand from the home country. And that is obviously going to be matched by the export supply from the foreign country. So the end result is a lower amount of trade. So before that quantity is traded, now obviously with the higher prices in the home country influencing the world price, that quantity is going to fall, and it's going to keep going until, as I said, the difference in the price is equal to the tariff. So that's the first thing to remember. And we need this sort of diagram here incorporating all, both the home and foreign and the world, because this home market is large, and so basically this decrease in demand makes a difference in terms of the world market. Yeah, and that's what causes that to happen. But you'll notice that the actual change in the price is less than the full size of the tariff. So the burden, if you like, is split or shared between the foreign producer, who gets a lower price for it, and the home market, which has a slightly higher price. So note, the price rise at home is less than the size of the tariff. The size of this price rise depends on the size of the importing country, which is what I was saying before. So that previous example was if it was a large country. The analysis though is different if it's actually a small country that we're talking about. In other words, if home is a small country. The reason for this is that basically that decrease in the domestic demand from the higher price, from the price plus the tariff, just doesn't get noticed in the world market. It doesn't affect the world market enough to move the price. So in other words, the effect on the exporting country, that P star T, is negligible, or in this example it's just 0. In other words, it doesn't change the world market. And so if that's the case, basically the difference here is that the full tariff will get passed on. Yeah, and so this example here, we don't need the world market and we don't need the foreign market, because essentially that, if I can go back to it, basically this doesn't change. So the import demand, because this home is a small country, the import demand just barely moves. It's a large country in the previous one, so it moved quite a bit. But when it's a small country, basically that import demand overall doesn't change. Therefore, the world price doesn't change. Therefore, the foreign country still is selling its good or exporting its good at the higher price, that PW. So, yeah. So now we can see, here's the world price that we had before. Here's the demand, here's the supply. So this is the imports before the tariffs. The price, basically this is this full amount of the tariff gets passed on, and so we get essentially a much greater effect. Yeah, you can see that here the imports after the the imports after the tariff is obviously going to be less, but the tariff does essentially what it is designed to do. Right? If it's to protect the local industry, that's kind of what it does. You can see that the higher price enables domestic firms to be competitive, if you like, even though it's a false competitiveness. They're more competitive because they can sell more at that higher price, but of course the higher price reduces the domestic demand for the good. And so that combination of a reduced amount of demand and an increased amount of supply reduces the size of the imports. So the size then is just this area here. So small country doesn't change the world market. Full amount of the tariff gets passed on, flows through, and affects essentially only the domestic home market. Large country moves the world price, and so you've got to allow for that. That burden will be shared between the foreign country with a lower price and the domestic country with the higher price. So that's just showing you the mechanics of it. What we're going to do next is we're going to look at the welfare effects of that. In other words, who gains, who loses, and overall for the countries, what happens. Does the tariff make the entire country, the aggregate situation, better or worse?